Let's start with a question. What's your favorite miracle? And I'll take one away from you, the resurrection. That's got to be everybody's favorite, but what's your favorite miracle?
Healing all the sick.
Healing the sick? Feeding the 5,000? Walking on the water. That one is pretty amazing. We actually have a picture of our daughter Beth walking on the water, but actually she's falling off of a sea-doo. But it looks like she's walking on top of the water. Somebody snapped the picture at exactly the right time. Any others? This one that we're going to talk about tonight is, all of them are amazing. This one is so amazing that it gets probably more attention, at least as far as Old Testament miracles, than any of the others. And I'll say up front, it's one of those things that eventually you have to either say, I believe because God said it, or you have to let it go. There's no way that this miracle could have happened unless God just intervened and made it happen. We're going to look at some explanations that people have come up with, but this one's out there. This is a very amazing miracle. So we're going to read starting in Joshua chapter 10, verse 1. You remember the Gibeonites? We talked about them last week, sneaky bunch. They came to Israel and lied about where they were from. They brought old worm-eaten bread, and their wineskins were old and decaying. And they told Israel that they had come from a long, long way away, but they had heard of Israel's prowess on the battlefield, and they wanted to make a treaty with them. And Israel, instead of asking God, said yes, and made a treaty with Gibeon. So Gibeon was a fairly near neighbor to them. They didn't live that far away, and we'll find that out. You could get there in about 12 hours on foot. And Gibeon, we're going to find out, was actually not a terrible ally, except that now that Israel has made a pact with them, they feel responsible to uphold that alliance. So chapter 10, starting in verse 1. Now Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had taken Ai and totally destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and that the people of Gibeon had made a treaty of peace with Israel and had become their allies. He and his people were very much alarmed at this because Gibeon was an important city, like one of the royal cities. It was larger than Ai, and all its men were good fighters. So Adonizedek, king of Jerusalem, appealed to Hoham, king of Hebron, Piram, king of Jarmuth, Japhia, king of Lachish, and Debir, king of Eglon. Come up and help me attack Gibeon, he said, because it has made peace with Joshua and with the Israelites. So the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, Hebron, Jarmuth, Lachish, and Eglon, joined forces. They moved up with all their troops and took up positions against Gibeon and attacked it. The Gibeonites then sent word to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal, do not abandon your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us. Help us, because all the Amorite kings from the hill country have joined forces together against us. So, again, the description of Gibeon is that they're fairly formidable. They're bigger than Ai, and Ai was a really small place, so that doesn't tell us that they were huge. But it does say that all of their men were good fighters, so they had a reputation of being able to hold their own in a fight, and it takes 5 kings in an alliance to come up against them. So you've got this evil axis coming against Gibeon, and now Gibeon is hollering for help from Joshua and Israel. This is the first time, I think, that Jerusalem gets called Jerusalem. It's kind of a throwback. I don't think the people that were living there at the time called it Jerusalem. We've only run across it one other time, and when Abraham went to battle to get Lot back from the kings that had come and attacked and taken Lot prisoner. While he's in that area, he runs into Melchizedek, who is described as the king of Salem. So that's the last half of Jerusalem, right? Salem means peace. Right? So the city of peace or the place of peace. Melchizedek is described as being its king at that time. At the time that Joshua is living, it's Adonizedek, and Adonizedek wants to go to battle against Gibeon, but he doesn't want to go by himself. So he gets together this alliance of other kings from the area, and they go and start their assault on the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites holler out for Joshua and Israel to come and save them. Right? Skip down to verse 9, and we'll see the response. After an all-night march from Gilgal, Joshua took them by surprise. The Lord threw them into confusion before Israel. So Joshua and the Israelites defeated them completely at Gibeon. Israel pursued them along the road going up to Beth Horon and cut them down all the way to Azekah and Makkedah. They fled from Israel on the road down from Beth Horon to Azekah, and the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Then Joshua returned with all of Israel to the camp at Gilgal. So the battle takes place kind of in three parts, and we'll look at the three parts. Number one, Joshua takes the armies of Israel and enacts an all-night march. So we're going to give them 12 hours of marching. They get all the way from Gilgal to Gibeon in one night. What does that tell you about the army of Israel at the time they arrive in Gibeon? They're wore out. Okay, this army is tired. One of the things that I think plays into this miracle is the need for these guys to have more time to do what they want to do rather than just one day. Secondly, God intervenes by throwing the armies, the Axis powers, into confusion, into panic mode. He does this in other battles. We've seen it before that we'll see it again, I guess. When we're in Judges, when Gideon attacks the army against which the Israelites are going that day, they absolutely freak out. They start killing each other while they're running away. So God has this panic mode that he can put on the opposite army, and they are terrified of Israel and Gibeon combined chasing after them. Secondly, or the second part of the battle, God attacks the fleeing army with a hailstorm. So it says that God kills more of the armies of the enemy than does Israel. So Israel is chasing them, but up ahead, God is pouring down the hailstorm on them while they're trying to get away. Look over to Exodus chapter 9. We've actually seen this before. Not the only time that God put the hailstorm on somebody. Exodus chapter 9, beginning in verse 13. I don't remember which plague this is. Somebody can count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6. Sounds close. The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and confront Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and against your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the face of the earth. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt, from the day it was founded until now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and every animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die. So this is at least the second time that God has used this particular plague against someone to send a rain of hailstones on them. Let's just conjecture. How big a hailstone do you need to kill somebody? I had one of my students at Northwestern, after she moved away, sent me a picture of a hailstone that had come through her windshield and was sitting on the dashboard in her car. You reckon that would do it? It was about a softball size hail. That sucker hit you in the head, that's all it takes, right? So they're falling from 30,000 feet and hit you in the head with that kind of velocity. That's all you need. So God is raining this stuff down on the enemy, and more people are killed from the hailstorm than are killed by the sword. So hang on to that for a couple of minutes. And then you get to the big one, right? In Joshua 10, beginning in verse 12, on the day that the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel. So we have what is categorized as a prayer, but Joshua is actually talking to the sun and the moon. Did you notice that? He prayed to God, but the form of the prayer is speaking to the sun and the moon. And then when we get down, it talks about the book of Jasher, which is not extant. We don't have copies of that. There is a spurious book of Jasher out there, and you can actually find that on the internet, but not the original book of Jasher that's being mentioned here, probably. But the Lord listened to a human being, it says. So he takes whatever it is that Joshua says, whether to him or to the sun and moon, and he honors that by way of a prayer. Sun stands still over Gibeon, moon stands still over the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself. And then you go on down, it says it delayed going down about a full day. So lots and lots of folks have tried to approach this passage and come up with a reasonable explanation of what God did on that day. And I'm going to give you 1, 2, 3, 4 of them that I've run across. And you may like one of these, you may like none of these, but these are what people have tried to do. I'll start by saying that NASA has not found a missing day. There's a urban legend that's been going around for years that somehow NASA came out and said, well, we figured out what happened that day. You know, it was when Joshua prayed in the day, so we've got a missing day. They have not done that. You can check with NASA and they'll tell you, no, we didn't come up with that. But I don't necessarily need NASA to back up my faith. So, you know, they've said a lot of things that I still don't believe, and they can believe what they will. So here are the possibilities. Number one, God simply suspended the laws of physics. If you've gotten out of the 6th grade science class, you're pretty aware of how all this works. The Earth is rotating on its axis at about 1,200 miles an hour. If God just stopped the Earth, everybody keeps going 1,200 miles per hour when the Earth stops. It's like throwing on your brakes. That's why you've got airbags to stop you when you don't stop when the car does. But that's a possibility. He created it. He can do whatever he wants to with it. So if he wanted to suspend the laws that he put in place and stop the Earth from spinning so that the sun was in the same place for a 24-hour period or an extra 12-hour period, ever how you want to read the text. Maybe he just suspended the laws of physics. Could God do that? I think we're all in agreement. God do pretty much whatever he wants to do. That would make it one of the most outrageous miracles that God ever performed. Yes? this would go beyond feeding the 5,000. This would go beyond maybe even walking on the face of the water. At least the world was still spinning while he was doing it. If you stop the world from spinning, that's a major, major miracle. Another one I ran across is really odd, and it has to do with what the Hebrew word means. Okay? It may not mean for the sun to stay where it is. It may mean that the sun should hide where it is. And so they came up with the idea that there was a lunar eclipse. Lunar eclipses don't last a whole day, right? Typically you think of a lunar eclipse lasting maybe 15 minutes would be a long period of time for the sun to hide. They did bring up a subject I thought that had some merit, and that was these guys have been marching all night. To fight in the heat of the day would have been a problem for them. So if there's an eclipse and the sun is blocked off, then perhaps that gives them an advantage in fighting so that they don't have the heat of the sun because the earth has passed between, or the moon has passed between the sun and the earth at that point. My biggest problem with that explanation is there has never been a day like it before or since. Well, there have been lots and lots of days like that before or since, so that one doesn't ring as true. But in the kind of the same line of thinking, the idea that the Lord sent a huge storm, right? The enemy is getting pelted. Adonai-Zedek is having to run away from hailstones big enough to kill you. So maybe God brings in the storm front, and the front of the front is out over the enemies, and they're getting pelted with the hailstones, and the Israelites are just more under the cloud cover. So that gives them shade from the sun, and what Joshua is praying for is that would continue. You know, sun, hide. Sun, don't do what you would normally do until we have finished doing what we came to do. But that does not explain the extra time frame of the sun being there. Right? Eventually, on a cloudy day, the sun still goes down, it still gets dark, and you don't get an extra part of a day or an extra full day to chase your enemies. And then the one that I really like, that perhaps it wasn't so much about the sun and the moon staying where they were, and more about the glory of God lighting the battlefield. That the sun and the moon, the earth kept spinning, but God's presence at the battlefield kept it lit for an extra period of time. So it seemed to the Israelites that they were actually under the sun, actually under the light of the sun, when it was God's glory that was keeping the battlefield lit. The book of Revelation, toward the end, when it's talking about heaven, it says they need no sun to light the day, and they need no moon to light the night, because the Lamb of God is all the light. So we at least have a poetic piece of scripture that says you don't need the sun if God's around. God can light. So those are the four different explanations that I ran across. And I ran across one guy. He didn't give them all, but he said that in his research, he had come across 12 different explanations for how this happened. The most important thing is not how God did it, but that God did it. And the explanation at the end is extremely important as well. Nothing like this has ever happened before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Now, has that happened before or since? Well, it certainly happened since. During Elijah's day, Elijah prayed that it wouldn't rain. It didn't rain for 3.5 years, right? So the Lord was still responding to the prayers of humans, especially humans that were leaders in God's, in his armies, in his nation. But when this was written, when Joshua was put together, Nothing like that had ever happened before. Nothing like that had happened since, that God listened to the request of a human being and that the Lord was fighting for Israel. So not just the hailstones, but also the extra light for the extra period of time so that the armies could continue their battle. One more reason that I like this as an explanation, and my opinion means absolutely nothing. I want you to come to grips with your faith on this. But for me, the idea that it was God who was providing the light rather than the sun standing still or the moon standing still, that you don't have to explain anything past that. There's no missing day. There's not a period of time when it wasn't. My first question, this is the way my mind works, is, well, okay, if you had an extra period of a day, then when it was night, was it really night? Did he start it spinning again at night so that night became day, or did we get messed up in there somewhere? The explanation that it's just God's presence that lights the battlefield, you don't have to explain anything scientifically past that. God provided, they won the battle and went home. If you look at the last part, and we're not going to get into it, but starting with verse 16, the 5 kings get away. They eventually get blocked up into a cave, right? So they hide from the battle. So these big bad kings are sure that they have, they've lost the battle, but they have been able to save themselves anyway. So verse 25, Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you are going to fight." So Joshua put the kings to death and exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles until evening. Okay, so we have another reference to, things are back to normal, right? They're left hanging on the poles until evening. And at sunset, because the sun was going down like normal, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down from the poles and threw them into the cave where they'd been hiding. And at the mouth of the cave, they placed large rocks, which are there to this day. So you get another one of those family vacation, weird Jewish Route 66 kind of references, where you're taking your family on vacation, and then there's the big, the world's biggest ball of yarn, and then over here we have this cave, and in that cave there are 5 skeletons of the people who thought that they could get together and beat Gilgal and Israel in a battle. So Joshua finishes everything that had to be finished in that battle. We're not going to spend any more time in Joshua. I would invite you to read through. They conquer some of the southern territory, which would include places like Bethlehem and Hebron and some of those other places to the south of Jerusalem. They don't take possession of Jerusalem until the time of David. So there's still a bunch of Jebusites who are living up there on top of the mountain. They defeat the king, they defeat the army, but they don't own Jerusalem. They don't move up there and take possession of it for probably another couple of 100 years.
You reckon them, I guess you might say the bones of them are still in that cave?
In that area, those bones might still be there because it's so arid. That's the same area where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, which should have turned to powder, 1,000 years ago. But it's so dry, it's so arid, that things last a little bit longer than you might expect them to. So, when we read this and it says, "and they are there to this day," we have to remember that we're talking about they were there to this day 3,000 years ago. But you never know. Yeah. If you find them, I'll come look. I'll pay an entry fee if you find them. I'll come and look. Anything else? All right, we'll say goodbye to you guys. We'll talk to you later.